A single disease redrew the map of the medieval world. By the end of this video, you will understand how that invisible force shattered old trade routes, turned labor systems upside down, and cracked the very foundations of belief across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. How could a pandemic reshape everything from the Silk Road to the power of the Church? And why did the same crisis lead some people to find new freedoms while others turned to persecution? The answers begin not with kings or armies, but with something far smaller and quieter, a microscopic visitor that arrived without warning. Could something as small as a flea truly bring empires to their knees? The answer lies in a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. This tiny organism, no larger than a speck of dust, carried a devastating power. Its journey began in the stomach of a flea. When the flea bit a rat, the bacteria multiplied and blocked the flea's digestive tract. Starving and desperate, the flea would bite again and again, each time regurgitating the bacteria into the wound. The rat soon became ill, and when the rat died, the flea would jump to the next warm body, often a human. This chain of transmission from flea to rat to person could unfold in a matter of days. Historians recognize three major waves of plague before the modern era. The first, known as the Justinianic Plague, swept across the Mediterranean between the 6th and 8th centuries. It weakened the Byzantine Empire and reshaped trade routes around Constantinople. The second and most famous wave, the Black Death, arrived in Europe in the 14th century. It traveled along the Silk Road and across the sea, reaching port cities with terrifying speed. The third wave continued in scattered outbreaks well into the 18th century. Each wave followed the same pattern: a sudden appearance, a swift spread, and a trail of hardship. The symptoms of plague were unmistakable and alarming. Swellings called buboes appeared in the groin, armpit, or neck, often accompanied by fever and chills. The illness could progress in a matter of days. Because people had no understanding of germs, they could not explain why one household fell sick while another remained healthy. The very idea of invisible organisms was unimaginable. Some blamed bad air, others blamed the stars, and still others believed it was a punishment from a higher power. This confusion only magnified the fear when the illness arrived. Without knowledge of contagion, communities had no reliable way to protect themselves. Some fled, carrying the bacteria to new regions. Others stayed and tried desperate remedies, from herbal poultices to public prayers. The economic shock followed close behind. When a third of a village could no longer work, fields went unplanted, goods went unmoved, and the old rhythms of trade faltered. The stage was set for a demographic collapse that would permanently alter the labor market and the balance of power. But before we see those changes, we must understand the sheer scale of the loss. How many people did these waves claim, and what did that mean for the survivors? The figures are almost too large to grasp. In Europe alone, historians estimate that between 30 and 60% of the population did not survive the Black Death. That is roughly 25 million people gone in just a few years. But the loss was not limited to Europe. In the Middle East, urban centers like Cairo and Damascus saw similar devastation, with some regions losing as many as a third of their inhabitants. China, too, suffered heavily during the same period, though precise numbers remain difficult to determine because records from that time are incomplete. When we combine these losses across continents, we are looking at a demographic shock unlike anything the medieval world had ever experienced. Entire villages simply vanished. Fields that had been cultivated for generations turned to weeds. Homes stood empty, their owners never to return. The survivors faced a world that had suddenly become far emptier, far quieter, and far more uncertain. This sudden disappearance of so many people created a labor crisis that no medieval institution was prepared to handle. Before the plague, workers had been plentiful and cheap. Landlords and nobles could count on a steady supply of peasants to till the soil, harvest crops, and perform countless other tasks. Overnight, that supply dried up. The workers who remained suddenly found themselves in high demand. They could ask for better pay, shorter hours, or more freedom, and if their lord refused, they could simply walk away to another estate that was desperate for hands. For the first time in centuries, ordinary people had real bargaining power. This reshuffling of the labor market sent shockwaves through every level of society. Nobles complained of insolent servants and lazy laborers. Governments tried to freeze wages by passing laws, but those laws were nearly impossible to enforce when so few workers remained. The old social order, built on a foundation of cheap labor and rigid hierarchy, began to crack. The first domain to feel that crack was the vast network of long-distance trade. The Silk Road, which for centuries had carried spices, silks, and ideas across Asia, had already been weakened by the plague itself. Caravans stopped moving because there were not enough merchants or drivers to keep them going. Port cities, once bustling with ships from distant lands, fell quiet. Goods that had been common, such as pepper, cloth, or dyes, became rare and expensive. But this disruption did not mean the end of trade. It meant that trade had to change, and as it changed, it would pull the entire world into a new era, one where old powers faded and new players emerged. The question was who would step into the vacuum. That vacuum first appeared along the ancient overland routes. The Silk Road, that vast web of trails connecting China to the Mediterranean, had for centuries carried caravans laden with silk, spices, porcelain, and ideas. But after the plague swept through, those caravans simply stopped coming. The merchants who organized them had fallen ill or fled. The camel drivers, the guards, the innkeepers along the way, all had been thinned out by the crisis. A route that once buzzed with activity turned silent. Sand drifted over sections of the trail. Goods that had been common in the markets of Venice or Cairo, such as Chinese silk or Indian pepper, became rare treasures. Their prices soared, but even that could not revive the trade because there were too few people left to move them. The same pattern repeated across the trans-Saharan routes. For generations, caravans had crossed the vast desert carrying gold, salt, and slaves. The major oasis towns that supported these journeys, places like Timbuktu and Gao in the south and Sijil Masa in the north, saw their populations shrink dramatically. Without enough workers to maintain the wells and trading posts, the journey became riskier. A single outbreak could wipe out an entire caravan. Merchants who had once made a comfortable living on these routes began to look elsewhere. The North African trade in gold and ivory slowed to a trickle. Some routes were abandoned entirely, their existence fading into memory. In Europe, the network of fairs and roads that connected towns and kingdoms suffered a similar fate. The great Champagne fairs in France, which had drawn merchants from across the continent, lost their crowds. Travelers feared the crowded marketplaces where illness might strike. Many smaller market towns saw their populations fall so low that the weekly market could no longer support itself. Roads that had once been busy with wagons and traders fell into disrepair. The cost of moving goods overland became prohibitive because labor was scarce and dangerous to hire. This was not just a temporary pause in trade, it was a structural breakdown. The old systems depended on a dense population to maintain roads, supply food for travelers, and provide enough buyers to make the journey worthwhile. When that population vanished, the entire logic of long-distance trade collapsed. Merchants faced a stark choice: either find new, safer routes or abandon entire markets. Some turned to rivers and coastal shipping, where a single ship could carry far more goods than 100 camels. Others began to bypass the overland routes altogether, sending goods by sea around the southern tip of Africa or through the Red Sea. The old centers of power along the Silk Road, cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar, lost their influence. They had been built for a world of caravans that no longer existed. Out of this disruption, new trade centers began to emerge. Port cities like Antwerp and Lisbon grew in importance as maritime routes gained favor. They were more resilient because a single ship could move large quantities of goods with a smaller crew, and the sea did not require the same network of roads and inns. Venice, already a maritime power, saw its strength increase. The future of trade would no longer belong to the merchants of the desert or the steppe. It would belong to those who could adapt to a world where the overland routes had been broken and where a new kind of commerce, faster, safer, and more centralized, was beginning to take shape. But that shift did not happen overnight, and it came with its own set of challenges, especially for the millions of workers who had suddenly found themselves in a world where their labor was worth more than ever before. Constantinople, once the jewel of overland trade, faded into shadow. For centuries, this great city had sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, its markets overflowing with goods from China, India, and the Baltic. Its wealth came from controlling the land routes that connected east and west, but the plague hit it hard. Repeated waves of illness drained its population, and the collapse of the Silk Road severed its lifeline. Without caravans arriving from the east, the city's merchants had less and less to sell. The imperial treasury, already strained by war and loss, could not keep the old trade networks alive. By the middle of the 15th century, Constantinople had shrunk into a shadow of its former self, a quiet city where empty warehouses outnumbered bustling shops. Its slow decline was not unique. Inland cities across Europe and the Middle East, places that had thrived on overland routes, found themselves stranded. The wealth that once passed through their gates now trickled away to a different kind of power. That power belonged to the sea. On the Italian peninsula, a handful of maritime cities had long understood that control of the water meant control of commerce. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa had spent generations building fleets and fortifying their harbors. When the plague disrupted overland routes, these republics were perfectly positioned to step in. Their ships could move large cargoes quickly and with smaller crews than a caravan required. They could bypass the broken roads and the dangerous inns. More importantly, they could reach ports across the entire Mediterranean and beyond, from Constantinople to Alexandria to the Black Sea. The crisis that crippled inland trade became their golden opportunity. But the Italian republics did not simply wait for business to come to them. They moved aggressively to secure their new position. Venice, in particular, understood that a single lost shipment could ruin a merchant. So the government stepped in. It began organizing state-backed convoys, fleets of armed merchant ships that traveled together for protection. These convoys followed fixed schedules and routes, ensuring that goods moved reliably even in dangerous times. Any merchant who paid a fee could place cargo on these ships, sharing the risk and the cost. This system, known as the Mude in Venetian, gave the Republic a huge advantage over its competitors. While other ports struggled to find sailors or pay for security, Venice offered a dependable service that traders could count on. Yet the greatest innovation came from an unexpected source: fear of the plague itself. The same disease that had shattered old trade routes now forced those who controlled the new routes to rethink how they handled goods and people. A ship arriving from a plague-stricken port could bring the illness with it, wiping out an entire city. Venice responded with a bold experiment. In the early 15th century, the city established the first permanent quarantine station on a small island called Lazzaretto. Any ship suspected of carrying disease was forced to anchor there for 40 days, its crew and cargo isolated from the mainland. This period, from which we get the word quarantine, came from the Italian for 40. The idea was simple but revolutionary. By cutting off the chain of transmission, Venice could protect its population while still allowing trade to continue. Other cities soon followed suit. Genoa established its own lazzaretto. Marseille and Ragusa adopted similar measures. These quarantine stations became permanent fixtures of maritime trade, a new layer of regulation that had never existed before. Governments now took responsibility for public health in a way they never had in the medieval period. They controlled which ships could enter harbor, they inspected cargo, and they enforced waiting periods. The old free-for-all of the marketplace gave way to a new order, one where the state played a central role. This shift did not happen overnight, and it was not without resistance. Merchants complained about delays and lost profits. Sailors grumbled about being stranded on barren islands for weeks, but the system worked. Venice suffered fewer outbreaks than many of its rivals, and its reputation as a safe trading partner grew. Traders from across the Mediterranean began to prefer Venetian ships and Venetian ports because they knew the city had taken steps to protect them. Trust became a commodity as valuable as silk or spice. The consequences of this new order reached far beyond the Italian peninsula. The rise of these maritime republics tilted the balance of power in Europe. Inland empires that had once dominated, such as the Byzantine and the Holy Roman, faded in influence. Wealth flowed toward the coasts. Cities like Barcelona, Marseille, and Ragusa followed the Venetian model, building their own fleets and quarantine systems. The future of trade belonged to those who could control the sea and manage the risk of disease. But this centralization came with a cost. It meant that the great diversity of medieval trade, the fairs, the caravans, the small market towns, gave way to a more controlled and regulated system. The world was becoming smaller, more connected, but also more disciplined, and the next great shift would come not from merchants or governments, but from the very people who survived the crisis, the workers who now knew their value. That quarantine station on the small island of Lazzaretto changed everything. In the year 1348, as the Black Death swept through Venice and wiped out half its population, the city officials made a desperate decision. Any ship arriving from a place where illness was present had to anchor offshore for 40 days. No one could come ashore, no cargo could be unloaded. The crew remained isolated on the vessel. If no one fell sick during that period, the ship was considered safe to enter the harbor. This was not a simple delay. It was the first organized attempt by a government to control the movement of people and goods based on the risk of disease. Venice did not invent quarantine out of scientific understanding. They had no knowledge of bacteria or germs, but they had observed a pattern. Illness seemed to arrive with ships from certain ports, and it tended to appear within a month or so after docking. 40 days gave them a margin of safety that seemed to work. The idea spread quickly. Genoa followed, Marseille followed. Within a few decades, most major Mediterranean ports had their own quarantine stations. But what started as a public health measure soon transformed into something far more powerful. Governments realized that quarantine gave them a reason to inspect every ship, every cargo, every crew list. They could demand documentation, they could charge fees for the use of the lazzaretto, they could refuse entry to ships from rival cities. Over time, quarantine became a tool for economic control. A port could enforce long waiting periods on ships from a competitor, effectively slowing down their trade while favoring their own merchants. It was a hidden form of protectionism, dressed up in the language of safety. The bureaucracy that grew around quarantine was immense. Officials kept detailed records of every incoming vessel. They recorded the health of the crew, the origin of the goods, the route taken. They issued certificates of health that became required for any ship that wanted to enter another port. A ship without a clean bill of health could be turned away or forced to wait even longer. This paperwork created a paper trail that had never existed before. It made trade trackable, verifiable, and controllable. the state had inserted itself into the heart of commerce in a way that would have seemed unimaginable a century earlier. These innovations did not remain confined to the Mediterranean. As maritime trade expanded beyond Europe, European powers carried the quarantine system with them. Colonies in the Americas and Asia adopted similar measures. The 40-day rule became the standard for international shipping. It was not until the 19th century that scientists developed a deeper understanding of disease transmission and replaced the fixed waiting period with more precise methods. But the core idea that governments have the right and duty to screen travelers and goods for health risks remains with us today. The quarantine station on Lazzaretto was a turning point. It marked the moment when public health became a matter of state authority, and when trade regulation began to look less like a marketplace free for all and more like a controlled system. That control came at a cost. It centralized power in the hands of port officials and bureaucrats. It created new forms of delay and expense, but it also gave people a sense of security, a feeling that someone was watching out for their well-being. That feeling would not last. The same forces that reshaped trade were also reshaping the lives of ordinary workers, and the old rules of labor were about to be torn apart. After the plague, the survivors discovered a startling truth. They were no longer replaceable, and that discovery would shake society to its core. The old certainties of the labor market flipped overnight. After the plague swept through, a landowner who had once counted on a dozen field hands might find only 3 or 4 left. A master craftsman who had trained a workshop full of apprentices now struggled to find even one willing worker. Households that relied on servants for cooking, cleaning, and caring for children suddenly had to manage on their own. The shortage was everywhere, in the fields, in the shops, and in the homes of the wealthy. And those who had survived quickly realized that their labor had become a rare and valuable commodity. A peasant who had spent his life bound to a single estate could now walk to the next village and demand twice the pay he had received before. A carpenter could name his price for a new roof or a plow. A servant could negotiate for better food, a shorter day, or a private room. Employers who refused to meet these new terms found themselves with empty fields and unfinished projects. The old system of fixed wages and inherited obligations simply could not survive when workers had so many alternatives. This shift terrified the ruling classes. Landowners saw their profits shrink. Nobles watched their estates fall into neglect. City governments worried that the cost of goods would spiral out of control. Their response was swift and heavy-handed. In England, just 1 year after the Black Death reached its shores, King Edward III issued an Ordinance of Labourers in the year 1349. The law declared that all able-bodied workers under the age of 60 must accept the same wages they had earned before the plague. Anyone who refused to work at those rates could be fined, imprisoned, or even branded with a hot iron. The ordinance also made it illegal to give alms to the able-bodied poor, forcing the unemployed to take whatever work they could find at the old rates. Similar laws appeared across Europe. The French king issued an ordinance capping wages and forbidding workers from leaving their villages. City councils in Florence, Barcelona, and Bruges passed regulations trying to freeze the labor market in place. But these laws ran into a hard reality. They could not force workers to stay where they did not want to be. A peasant who was denied a raise could simply slip away at night and find a new master in a different district. A craftsman could move to a town where the rules were not enforced. The authorities could not patrol every road or watch every field. The shortage of labor gave workers a freedom they had never known, and they used it. At the same time, employers began to compete against each other openly. A lord desperate to harvest his grain before it rotted would offer extra food or a bonus payment. A wealthy merchant would promise a servant a share of his profits. These under-the-table deals became common because the official wages were too low to attract anyone. The gap between the law and real life grew wider every season. The ordinances did little more than create resentment on both sides. Workers saw the laws as unfair attempts to keep them poor. Landowners saw workers as greedy and ungrateful. The old bonds of loyalty, which had held medieval society together for centuries, snapped under this strain. This conflict between those who needed labor and those who provided it would not stay quiet. The bitterness simmered in villages, in market towns, and in the crowded streets of cities. It was a powder keg, and the tinder was already dry. The next spark would come not from a disease, but from the people who had survived it and now refused to accept their old place in the world. Across Europe and beyond, the survivors decided they had been pushed far enough. The tension that had been building for decades finally erupted into open defiance. In the year 1381, England witnessed a massive uprising that historians still study as a turning point. Thousands of common people, peasants, craftsmen, and laborers, marched toward London under the leadership of a man named Wat Tyler. They carried banners and demanded an end to serfdom, the right to work for fair wages, and freedom from the old obligations that tied them to the land. Their journey was peaceful at first, but it sent a jolt of fear through the ruling class. When they reached the capital, they burned tax records and property documents, symbols of the system that kept them in place. For a few tense days, they held the city in a state of uncertainty. The young king, Richard II, agreed to meet them and promised to grant their requests. But the promise was a trick. Wat Tyler was killed during a later confrontation, and the revolt was crushed with brutal force. The leaders were hunted down, and the old laws were temporarily reaffirmed. Yet the damage to feudalism was already done. The ruling class had seen how fragile their power really was. Across the English Channel, a similar fury had already exploded in France. The uprising known as the Jacquerie erupted in the year 1358, just a decade after the Black Death first struck. The name came from a mocking term for a peasant, Jacques, but there was nothing laughable about the revolt itself. Villagers who had seen their fields ruined, their families lost, and their lords' demand the same old rents and services finally snapped. They attacked castles, burned manor houses, and killed anyone they associated with the old oppressive order. The violence was swift and terrifying to the nobility, but just as in England, the revolt was met with overwhelming retaliation. Nobles from across the region banded together, hunted down the rebels, and slaughtered them by the hundreds. The Jacquerie was crushed within weeks, but the memory of it lingered. It showed that the poor were no longer willing to suffer in silence. In the bustling city of Florence, the unrest took a different form. Here, the workers were not peasants in the fields, but laborers in the wool workshops. These were the Ciompi, the lowest class of textile workers, who had no political voice and earned barely enough to survive. In the summer of 1378, they rose up, not just for higher wages but for the right to form their own guild and participate in the city government. For a brief period, they succeeded. A new government was established that included representatives from the lower classes. They passed reforms that limited the power of the wealthy merchants and gave the poor a seat at the table. But it did not last. The rich guilds conspired to restore the old order, and within a few years the Ciompi were pushed back down. Their revolt had failed, but it planted a seed. Ordinary people had tasted political power, and the memory of that taste did not fade easily. The unrest was not limited to Europe. In Egypt, under the rule of the Mamluk Sultanate, rural laborers and Bedouin tribes rose up against the heavy taxes and forced labor that followed the plague. The population had fallen so sharply that the remaining workers were expected to produce the same amount of grain and goods for the state. They refused. Protests turned into armed rebellions that the Mamluks struggled to suppress. The once mighty agricultural system of the Nile Valley never fully recovered. In China, where the plague had arrived a generation earlier, the Mongol Yuan dynasty faced similar challenges. the Red Turban Rebellion, which began in the mid-14th century, drew much of its strength from peasants who had lost family members and livelihoods. They demanded lower taxes, an end to corruption, and the right to control their own land. That rebellion eventually toppled the Yuan dynasty and brought the Ming dynasty to power. The connection to the plague is not always obvious, but historians see a clear pattern. When a crisis wipes out a huge portion of the population, the survivors ask themselves why they should continue to obey the same masters. These revolts were not simply about money. They were about dignity, about the right to move freely, to choose one's own work, to be treated as something more than a possession tied to a plot of land. The old feudal system had been built on the idea that every person had a fixed place, and that place was decided by birth. A serf was born a serf and would die a serf. The plague cracked that idea open. When a lord could no longer force a peasant to stay, the entire structure wobbled. When a worker could walk away and find a better offer elsewhere, the lord's authority became a hollow threat. The revolts themselves were crushed, the leaders killed, and the old laws reinstated, but the underlying shift could not be undone. The survivors knew their worth, and they would not forget. In the decades that followed, the feudal system did not collapse overnight. It crumbled slowly, piece by piece. Lords found it harder to enforce old obligations. Peasants began to negotiate written leases that gave them more freedom. In many parts of Europe, serfdom faded into a formal relic, replaced by a system of tenant farmers who paid rent rather than service. The labor shortage forced landowners to innovate, to invest in new tools and techniques rather than rely on cheap human labor. The old world, where a man's worth was determined at birth, was giving way to something new. And that something new would be built not by nobles or kings, but by the ordinary people who had survived the plague and refused to go back to the way things were. The stage was set for a deeper transformation that would eventually reshape the very foundations of society, and that transformation touched perhaps the most powerful institution of all, the church. In the countryside, the old system of serfdom began to dissolve, not all at once, but season by season. A lord who could not find a plowman to till his fields faced a simple choice: either let the land lie fallow or offer something more attractive than the traditional duties. Across much of Western Europe, the lords chose to compromise. Instead of demanding that a peasant work 3 days a week on the lord's land without pay, they began to accept a cash payment in exchange for releasing that obligation. This shift, called commuting labor services, was a quiet revolution. A peasant who could pay a small yearly rent became a tenant farmer, bound not by birth but by a contract. He could keep the harvest he grew, sell the surplus, and pass his earnings to his children. The old hereditary bondage, where a person was born attached to a plot of soil and could not leave without permission, weakened with every such agreement. Landlords discovered that a free tenant who paid rent was often more productive than a resentful serf who worked only enough to avoid punishment. Money began to replace manpower as the currency of rural life. Manorialism, the system where a lord owned everything on his estate and controlled every aspect of life, could not survive this transformation. When peasants held cash, they could buy their freedom, move to a neighboring village, or even purchase their own small plot. The manor courts lost their power to enforce old rules. The lord's authority became limited to the land he owned directly, not the people who lived on it. This was not an overnight collapse. It unfolded over decades, and the pace varied by region. In England, serfdom faded into irrelevance by the end of the 15th century, though it was never formally abolished. In France and the Low Countries, the pattern was similar. Commutation became the norm, and the number of free peasants grew steadily, but not all of Europe followed this path. In Eastern Europe, the same shortage of labor produced the opposite result. Lords in Poland, Bohemia, and the Baltic regions saw their peasants trying to flee to more prosperous areas. Instead of offering cash rents or freedom, the local nobility used their political power to tighten control. They passed laws that bound peasants even more firmly to the land. They extended the number of unpaid labor days, sometimes requiring 4 or 5 days of work on the lord's fields each week. They restricted movement, requiring written permission to travel or marry. This system, known as the Second Serfdom, locked millions of people into a harsher servitude than their grandparents had known. Why this stark difference? The answer lies in the existing power structures. In Western Europe, kings and central governments had grown strong enough to check the influence of the local nobility. Peasants could appeal to royal courts for protection, and towns offered an escape route. Landlords who tried to impose harsh terms risked losing their workforce entirely because workers could simply walk to a nearby city. In Eastern Europe, the opposite was true. The nobility dominated the weak central governments. Towns were few and small, with little political power. Peasants had no place to flee, and the lords could enforce their will through local courts and private armies. The plague did not create these different outcomes. It acted as a catalyst, accelerating the trends that were already present. Where lords had to compete for labor, they turned to cash and freedom. Where lords could coerce labor without consequence, they tightened the screws. The same crisis, the same loss of population, produced two very different worlds, and that freed labor did not simply vanish. It flowed into the towns. Peasants who had saved enough to pay their commutation, or who simply slipped away under cover of night, arrived at city gates with nothing but their skills. They became carpenters, weavers, bricklayers, and merchants. They filled the workshops that had lost their own workers to the plague. They brought energy and ambition into places that had once been sleepy market towns. The urban centers, already growing from the shift in trade, swelled with new arrivals. The old feudal order, which kept people tied to the land, was giving way to a more mobile, more fluid society. And with that mobility came new questions about who held authority and why. The cities became the answer to that question. Walls that had once kept out enemies now welcomed a flood of newcomers, each carrying a set of skills and a hunger for a new kind of life. A peasant who had spent his youth behind a plow arrived in a town like Bruges or Florence and discovered that his hands could be put to 100 different trades. He could learn to weave wool, shape leather, hammer iron, or carve stone. The workshops were desperate for apprentices, and the old rules that limited who could enter a craft had loosened because so many experienced workers had been lost. A man who had never held a tool more complex than a scythe could, within a few seasons, become a skilled artisan earning coin that would have been unthinkable back on the manor. This influx of labor did not depress wages as one might expect. Quite the opposite. The demand for goods surged as the surviving population sought to replace worn tools, rebuild neglected homes, and clothe themselves in fabrics that had become scarce during the plague years. Tailors, bakers, carpenters, and smiths found themselves in an enviable position. There were more customers than there were craftsmen to serve them. A master carpenter could charge double what his father had charged. A journeyman weaver could demand a share of the profits rather than a fixed wage. The workshop floor became a place of negotiation, not command. At the heart of this new urban economy stood the guilds. These associations of craftsmen had existed for centuries, but their power had been limited by the abundance of labor. Now, with skilled workers so rare, the guilds became gatekeepers of opportunity. They controlled who could enter a trade, what standards of quality had to be met, and what prices could be charged, but they also protected their members. A guild that negotiated with the city council for higher peace rates or better working conditions could now do so from a position of strength. If the council refused, the guild could simply withhold its labor, and without those workers, the city's markets would grind to a halt. Strikes and work stoppages became more common, and they often succeeded. This new power did not only belong to the guilds themselves. Individual masters and merchants began to accumulate wealth at a pace that would have been impossible before the plague. A master dyer who owned his own vats and could afford the expensive imported woad could sell his cloth at premium prices. A merchant who had established a reliable shipping route for Flemish wool could buy up the output of a dozen villages. These men were not nobility. They did not inherit vast estates or titles. They earned their status through commerce and craft. They built stone houses in the city centers, donated money to the cathedral, and married their children into the families of other successful tradespeople. They formed a new social layer, a proto-middle class that sat between the old aristocracy and the mass of laborers. Their influence extended beyond the marketplace. They served on city councils, funded public works, and commissioned art that celebrated their wealth and piety. The guild halls that still stand in cities like Ghent, Siena, and Nuremberg are monuments to this era, built with the profits of a generation that had survived crisis and turned it into opportunity. These men and women did not overthrow the old order, but they quietly reshaped it. Authority now flowed not just from birth and land, but from skill, capital, and the ability to organize. And within this bustling urban world, one more door creaked open, a door that had been nearly sealed shut in earlier centuries. The same labor shortage that gave a peasant bargaining power also created space for women to step into roles that had long been closed to them. Wives who had once worked only alongside their husbands in a household workshop now found themselves running the business alone while their husbands traveled or recovered from illness. Widows inherited guild memberships and kept the shop going. Daughters learned trades that had been reserved for sons. The city, with its crowded streets and constant bustle, became a place where old assumptions began to weaken and new possibilities, fragile but real, began to take shape. Across the cities of Europe, a quiet but profound shift was taking place inside workshops and kitchens. The same labor shortage that had given a peasant bargaining power now cracked open a door that had long been barred to half the population. Women who had always worked but rarely in roles that came with recognition or pay began stepping into positions that had been reserved for men. The change did not happen because of any great proclamation. It happened because there were simply not enough hands to do the work. A brewer who had lost his apprentices found that his wife or daughter could stir the mash just as well as any journeyman. A baker whose sons had not survived could rely on a niece to knead the dough and tend the oven. A weaver who had no one to operate the loom trained a daughter in the family shop. These were not experimental efforts, they were acts of survival, and when the work was done, the women kept doing it. In the textile towns of Flanders and northern Italy, the demand for cloth skyrocketed after the plague. The old workshops could not keep up. Women moved into carding, spinning, and even dyeing, tasks that had been considered too laborious or too skilled for them. Some guilds resisted at first, but the pressure from merchants desperate for finished cloth forced them to bend. In cities like Ghent, women were allowed to work as members of a family shop, though they could not hold a guild membership in their own name. It was a compromise, but it gave them a foothold. Meanwhile, in the breweries of England, the alewives who had once been pushed aside by male-dominated commercial brewing returned. Before the plague, brewing had been a household task for wives, but as demand grew and profits climbed, men had taken over the trade. Now, with so many men gone, women once again ran the mash tuns and sold their ale at the front door. The term alewife became common again, and some of these women became prosperous enough to own their own buildings and employ others. A parallel story unfolded among the widows. In a world where death had taken so many husbands, thousands of women inherited workshops, tools, and contracts. Many of them had spent years assisting their spouses and knew the trade intimately. They did not simply sell off the inventory and retreat. They continued to run the business. In the records of cities like Paris and London, we find widows listed as armorers, goldsmiths, and even apothecaries. They hired apprentices, negotiated with suppliers, and took their disputes to court. Some guilds allowed widows to keep the shop open for the rest of their lives, provided they did not remarry outside the trade. For a generation, these women held a share of the urban economy that had not been seen in centuries. Not all of this movement was upward. Many women who had no family business to inherit moved into domestic service, working as maids, cooks, and laundresses in the homes of the wealthy. Others found wage labor on the farms that still needed hands. They threshed grain, weeded fields, and harvested crops alongside men, earning a daily wage that was usually lower but still a visible income. In both the countryside and the city, women became a visible part of the paid workforce. They were no longer hidden inside the household economy. Their labor had a measurable value that employers competed for, just as they competed for male workers. But this shift was fragile and met with resistance almost from the start. The same authorities who had tried to cap wages for men now tried to push women back into the home. Guilds that had reluctantly admitted widows moved to restrict their rights after the crisis passed. Preachers and moralists warned that a woman who worked outside her proper sphere was a threat to the social order. Some cities passed laws that barred unmarried women from living alone, forcing them into service or marriage. The late 14th and 15th centuries saw a concerted effort to roll back many of these gains. Women were gradually excluded from the skilled trades again. Brewing once again became a male-dominated industry. The alewives faded from the records. Yet the seeds had been planted. The experience of working for wages, negotiating contracts, and managing a business did not disappear from collective memory. Daughters heard stories of grandmothers who had run their own shops. The idea that a woman could be economically independent, even temporarily, became thinkable in a way it had not been before. And this subtle shift in who could work and in what capacity opened the door for the next great transformation. With labor scarce and wages high, the entire medieval economy had to find ways to do more with less. That pressure would soon give birth to new technologies and new ways of thinking, innovations that would change not just who worked, but how the work itself was conceived. A single worker could now do the work of 5 if the right tools stood beside them. That is exactly what happened across the farms and workshops of the post-plague world. With fewer hands to turn the soil or grind the grain, necessity forced a quiet revolution in how people worked. The heavy plow, an innovation that had existed for centuries in some regions, finally became widespread. Before the plague, many villages had clung to the old scratch plow, a light tool that barely broke the surface. It required multiple passes and many oxen. The heavy plow, with its iron blade and moldboard, could cut deep, turn the soil, and create drainage furrows in a single pass. One man with a team of horses could now plow a field that had once occupied 3 or 4 laborers for days. The time saved was enormous, and in a world where every hour of human effort was precious, that time translated into survival. Farmers also turned to improved crop rotation. The old system of leaving half the land fallow each year wasted precious acreage. With fewer mouths to feed but the same need for grain, peasants began adopting a 3-field system. They planted 1 field in winter wheat, 1 in spring oats or barley, and left only the 3rd fallow. This simple change increased the amount of land under cultivation by 1/3 without requiring a single extra worker. Legumes like peas and beans were sometimes planted in the fallow field, which restored nitrogen to the soil. The land became more productive, and the diet of the common person gained a little more variety. Meanwhile, the power of moving water and wind became more important than ever before. Watermills had dotted European rivers since Roman times, but after the plague, their numbers multiplied. A single mill could grind enough grain for an entire village, replacing the hours of hand grinding that had kept women and children busy every morning. Lords who owned the mill rights invested in larger, more efficient designs. They built dams and mill ponds to ensure a steady flow even during dry months. Windmills appeared on the flat plains of northern Europe where rivers were scarce. The familiar post mill, with its entire body turned to face the wind, spread across the Low Countries and England. These machines did not just grind grain. They powered fulling mills that beat wool into felt, sawmills that cut timber, and blast furnaces that blew air into iron smelters. The workshop, like the field, was learning to harness nature to compensate for the absence of human hands. The same logic drove innovations in shipbuilding and navigation. Maritime trade had become the lifeline of the new economy, and every ship that sailed needed fewer crew members to carry more cargo. Shipwrights in the Basque Country and the Hanseatic ports began building the cog, a sturdy, single-masted vessel with a flat bottom and a stern-mounted rudder. This design required a smaller crew than the old Viking-style ships, yet it could carry heavier loads and sail closer to the wind. The compass, which had arrived from China centuries earlier, came into wider use. Portolan charts, detailed maps of coastlines and harbors, replaced the vague sailing directions of earlier times. A captain could now plan a voyage with confidence, reducing the time lost to guesswork and storms. With fewer sailors available, every voyage had to count. The result was a leaner, more efficient fleet that connected the newly emerging trade centers with greater reliability. Yet these practical solutions, for all their ingenuity, could not address a deeper void that had opened inside the survivors. The same crisis that had forced people to build better plows and faster ships had also forced them to ask questions that no machine could answer. Why had this happened? Why them? Why were some spared while others were taken? The churches and chapels that had once provided comfort now seemed hollow to many. The old belief that the world was governed by a divine plan that made sense had been shattered by the randomness of the plague. And it was in that crack, that opening between what people had been taught and what they had witnessed, that the next great transformation would take root, not in the fields or the shipyards, but in the very soul of society. The church had promised protection, but the plague ignored every prayer. Across Europe and the Middle East, communities turned to their most trusted source of comfort, only to watch it fail. Priests led processions through empty streets, carrying statues of saints and fragments of holy relics, hoping that a show of collective devotion would turn the tide. People filled the cathedrals, kneeling for hours, lighting candles and reciting every prayer they knew. Nothing changed. The illness continued its quiet work, indifferent to faith or status. A bishop who blessed the crowd one morning could be gone by nightfall. A monastery that offered sanctuary could become a place of silence within a week. The traditional remedies, the rituals that had sustained belief for generations, had lost their power. This failure struck at something deeper than fear. For centuries, the church had presented itself as the ultimate authority on the unseen world. It explained why good harvests came and why storms struck. It offered a framework for understanding suffering as a test or a punishment with a purpose. But the plague did not fit that framework. Entire convents of devout nuns were taken. Priests who administered last rites to the dying fell themselves. Children who could not have committed sins severe enough to warrant such a fate were taken just as often as adults. The randomness of it all made the old explanations feel hollow. If God was just and merciful, why did the innocent suffer alongside the guilty? If the church truly held the keys to salvation, why could it not stop this invisible horror? These questions did not arise all at once, but they spread like the illness itself, quietly and then all at once. In the vacuum left by this crisis of authority, a new kind of spiritual hunger emerged. People did not abandon belief altogether. Instead, they began to seek a more personal, more direct connection with the divine. the elaborate hierarchies of the Church, with its bishops, cardinals, and pope all mediating between humanity and God, began to feel distant and inadequate. Survivors wanted something immediate, something that could speak to their pain without the filter of a distant institution. This shift did not happen in a single place or among a single group. It unfolded across the entire Christian world, taking three distinct forms that would shape belief for centuries to come. The first response was extreme penance. Groups of people called flagellants in Europe took to the roads in long processions. They walked from town to town, dressed in rough robes, carrying crosses and chanting hymns. At each stop, they would gather in a public square and, in a highly ritualized display, whip themselves with leather straps tipped with metal spikes. They did this not out of madness but out of a desperate logic. If the plague was a punishment from God, then perhaps the punishment could be appeased by an even greater display of suffering. The flagellants believed that their own pain could substitute for the pain of the world, that by taking the scourge upon themselves, they could convince a wrathful deity to relent. The practice spread rapidly across Germany, the Low Countries, and into France. Crowds gathered to watch, some weeping, others joining in. The Church initially tolerated the movement, then condemned it as heretical when the flagellants began to claim that their rituals were more powerful than the sacraments of the priesthood. The authority of the clergy was being challenged not by rebels but by the most devout of the faithful. The second response was darker and more tragic. When people could not find a cause they could understand, they looked for someone to blame. Rumors spread that the plague was not a natural disaster but a deliberate act. Certain groups, particularly Jewish communities, were accused of poisoning wells or casting curses that brought the illness upon Christians. These accusations had no basis in fact, but they offered a simple explanation for an incomprehensible tragedy. The result was a wave of persecution that swept across Europe. Entire communities were rounded up and burned alive, their property seized, their synagogues destroyed. In cities like Strasbourg, Basel, and Mainz, hundreds of people were killed in a single day, not for any crime but because fear needed a target. The Church condemned these attacks, but its voice was weak. Local rulers, desperate to appease angry mobs, often looked the other way or actively participated. This pattern of scapegoating, of turning suspicion into violence, left scars that would last for generations. It also revealed a terrible truth about human nature. When the old certainties fail, the search for meaning can turn toward cruelty as easily as toward prayer. The third response was quiet and inward. Many individuals turned away from public rituals altogether and toward a private, contemplative form of faith. They read devotional texts in their own language, prayed alone in their rooms, and sought a personal relationship with God that did not require a priest or a cathedral. This movement, known as the modern devotion in the Low Countries, emphasized humility, simplicity, and inner transformation over outward display. Laypeople, including women who had no formal role in the Church, formed small communities called beguinages, where they lived in prayer and service without taking formal vows. They copied manuscripts, taught children, and cared for the sick. Their faith was not loud or spectacular. It was patient, steady, and deeply personal. This quiet current would eventually feed into the larger streams of reform that would reshape Christianity in the centuries ahead. Three paths emerged from the same crisis: the path of public penance, the path of persecution, and the path of inner devotion. Each offered a different answer to the same desperate question: what does it mean to believe when the world falls apart? The first two would eventually fade, suppressed by authorities or discredited by their own excesses. But the third, the turn toward the personal and the inward, would prove to be the most lasting. It planted a seed that would grow slowly, underground for generations. And when it finally broke the surface, it would change not just how people prayed, but how they understood their own place in the universe. The first path was the loudest, a desperate cry carved into flesh. Across the roads of Germany and the Low Countries, groups of laypeople began to gather and march from town to town. They walked barefoot, dressed in rough robes, carrying crosses and banners. When they reached a public square, they would form a circle and begin a ritual that horrified and fascinated everyone who watched. They stripped to the waist and, using whips tipped with metal spikes, struck their own backs rhythmically while chanting prayers. The skin broke and blood ran down their bodies. They believed that the plague was a punishment from God for the sins of humanity. If they could take that punishment upon themselves, if they could offer their own suffering as a substitute, perhaps the Almighty would relent. Each lash was an act of bargaining, a plea written in pain. The movement spread with astonishing speed. It started in the Balkans and moved northward through Hungary into German lands. By the year 1349, thousands of flagellants were crossing the countryside. They moved in organized bands, each led by a master who read letters supposedly from heaven. Crowds gathered to watch them pass, and many joined the processions, carried away by the intensity of the spectacle. In cities like Strasbourg, Mainz, and Cologne, the flagellants held massive public ceremonies. Local authorities were uncertain how to respond. Some welcomed them, seeing their piety as a blessing. Others feared the disruption their presence caused. But the church watched with growing unease. The flagellants were not acting under the authority of any bishop. They did not seek permission. They claimed that their rituals carried a special power, a power that bypassed the usual channels of confession and absolution. The priests and bishops, they implied, were not doing enough. At first, the church tried to control the movement by attaching priests to the groups, but the flagellants refused. They insisted that their master had received direct revelation, making the clergy unnecessary. This was a direct challenge to the church's monopoly on the sacred. In October of 1349, Pope Clement VI issued a formal condemnation. He declared the flagellant movement heretical. He ordered all rulers to suppress the groups and arrest their leaders. The whip, he said, was no substitute for the sacraments. The movement did not vanish overnight, but it was driven underground. Many flagellants were imprisoned or executed. The public processions faded, and the spectacle of collective penance became a memory. Yet the seed had been planted. The idea that ordinary people could seek salvation through their own efforts, outside the authority of the institutional church, had taken root. It would not be the last time that a crisis of faith pushed people to look for answers beyond the walls of the cathedral. And as that search for meaning continued, it did not always turn inward toward hope. Sometimes it turned outward toward a target. When suffering could not be explained by one's own sins, the mind looked for a face to blame. That target was often a neighbor who looked different or practiced a different faith. In the chaos of the plague, when every familiar explanation failed, fear needed a face. Across Europe, that face belonged to the Jewish communities who had lived alongside Christians for generations. A rumor spread that the plague was not a natural disaster but a deliberate act. Jews, it was whispered, were poisoning the wells of Christian towns. There was no evidence for this claim, none at all. The wells in Jewish quarters were just as likely to be tainted, and Jewish families suffered the same losses as their neighbors. But reason rarely prevails when fear is at its peak. The accusation took hold because it offered a simple, satisfying answer to an unbearable question. If the illness was not random, if it was the work of human hands, then it could be stopped. All that was needed was to root out the poisoners. In city after city, the mobs gathered. Local authorities, eager to deflect anger or too weak to resist, gave in to the demands. The worst wave of violence occurred in the year 1349. In Strasbourg, the city council initially tried to protect the Jewish population. But pressure from the guilds and the common people grew unbearable. On February 14th, in a brutal episode that scholars still study with sorrow, the entire community of roughly 2,000 people was rounded up, led to a prepared site outside the walls and lost their lives in a single day. Their property was confiscated and their synagogue was turned into a church. Strasbourg was not alone. In Mainz, in Cologne, in Basel, in Brussels, the same pattern repeated. Over the course of a few years, hundreds of Jewish communities across Europe were destroyed. Some were given the choice to convert, but most refused. The violence was not random. It followed the path of the plague itself. Wherever the illness struck hardest, the accusations followed soon after. The persecutors did not see the contradiction. They were terrified of a disease they could not understand, and they turned that terror into cruelty. This wave of persecution did not target only Jewish communities. Other outsiders also came under suspicion. Lepers, who already lived on the margins of society, were accused of spreading the illness through poison or corrupted air. In France, dozens of leper colonies were attacked or disbanded. Muslims living in Christian territories, particularly in Spain and Sicily, faced similar accusations and violence. Small groups of travelers, healers, and anyone who seemed foreign or secretive became targets. The world had shrunk to a place where trust dissolved, and the stranger was always guilty. The long-term consequences of these events were devastating. Trust between communities, already fragile in many regions, was shattered for centuries. Jewish survivors who fled eastward into Poland and Lithuania found relative safety, but the memory of what had happened in the West was carried with them. The religious divides that had always existed were now hardened by blood. In many places, the old pattern of coexistence, never perfect but functional, gave way to deep-seated suspicion and legal exclusion. Public authorities, who had sometimes tried to protect minorities during the crisis, learned a bitter lesson. Their power was limited when faced with a frightened populace. Some rulers later attempted to invite Jewish families back, recognizing the economic value they brought, but the damage could not be undone. The scapegoating of the plague years left a scar that would not heal. It showed how quickly a society could turn on its own members when the usual structures of meaning collapse. And that collapse was not limited to the city streets and the execution grounds. It reached into the quiet places where faith was nurtured, into the monasteries and the solitary cells, where a different kind of response was taking shape, one that would eventually lead not to violence, but to a slow, determined search for a more personal truth. The third path was the quietest, but it would prove the most enduring. While some lashed their backs and others lashed out at their neighbors, a different kind of faith was taking root in the silence of private rooms and small community houses. In the Low Countries, a movement called the Devotio Moderna, or modern devotion, began to spread among ordinary people. It did not require grand cathedrals or elaborate rituals. It asked only for a humble heart, a book, and a willingness to turn inward. Followers of this path gathered in houses called brotherhoods or sisterhoods, living simply, sharing resources, and dedicating themselves to prayer, reading, and service. They did not take formal vows like monks or nuns. They remained part of the everyday world, working at trades, caring for the sick, and raising children. Their devotion was not performed for an audience. It was lived quietly, moment by moment. They read scripture in their own language, copied devotional texts by hand, and meditated on the life of Christ not as a distant story but as a personal example. One of the most famous texts to emerge from this tradition was the Imitation of Christ, a small book that would be read by millions in the centuries to come. Its message was simple: follow the example of Jesus in your daily actions, and you will find peace. The movement was led by a man named Geert Groot, a preacher who had been deeply affected by the suffering he witnessed during the plague years. He believed that the church had become too focused on outward displays and political power. True faith, he taught, was a matter of the heart. His followers, called the Brethren of the Common Life, opened schools where they taught children to read and write. not just for practical reasons, but so that every person could encounter the divine directly through the written word. Alongside this quiet revolution, a stream of mystical writings began to flow from women who had experienced the plague and its aftermath in profound ways. In the German lands, a woman named Mechthild of Magdeburg wrote a book called The Flowing Light of the Godhead. She did not write in Latin, the language of scholars, but in her native German. Her words were raw and personal. She described her encounters with God not as distant theological concepts, but as intimate, overwhelming experiences. She wrote about suffering not as a punishment, but as a meeting place, a space where the soul could come face to face with something greater than itself. Across the English Channel, another woman, Julian of Norwich, lived through the plague and recorded her own visions. She was an anchorite, meaning she chose to live in a small room attached to a church, spending her life in prayer and reflection. In her book Revelations of Divine Love, she wrote about a vision of Christ that showed her a hazel nut in the palm of her hand. She asked what it meant, and she said she was told that it was everything that is made, and that it exists because God loves it. From that vision she drew a famous conclusion: all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. These words were not a denial of the suffering around her. They were a statement of trust, a belief that beneath the chaos there was a love that held everything together. These mystical writers did not speak for the church. They spoke for themselves out of their own experience. They claimed that a person could know the divine directly without a priest as a middleman. This was a radical idea, even if it was expressed in gentle, poetic language. It suggested that authority did not flow only from the Pope or the bishop. It could also flow from a woman in a small room, from a lay brother in a simple house, from a peasant reading a psalm by candlelight. The seeds of this idea spread quietly through the networks of the modern devotion, through the copying of manuscripts, through the conversations of small groups who gathered to read and pray together. These seeds would take more than a century to grow into the full flower of the Protestant Reformation, but they were already alive, already pushing through the soil of a world that had been broken open by the plague. And as this inner devotion deepened, it began to reshape not only how people prayed, but how they saw the world around them, a shift that would soon find its voice in paint and ink. The plague painted death into every corner of art. Before the crisis, the paintings and sculptures that filled churches and cathedrals told a story of triumph. They showed Christ rising in glory, saints performing miracles, and the faithful ascending to a golden paradise. The world after the crisis demanded a different kind of image, one that did not flinch from what everyone had witnessed. Artists began to depict death itself, not as a distant enemy but as a constant companion. The most famous of these new images was the Danse Macabre, a procession in which figures from all walks of life, a king, a bishop, a peasant, a child, were led by a grinning skeleton. It was a leveling scene. No wealth, no title, no piety could stop the dance. The message was blunt. Everyone would join this line, and no one could refuse. These images covered the walls of charnel houses and cemetery cloisters, especially in France and Germany. In the Cemetery of the Holy Innocents in Paris, a long mural of the Danse Macabre was painted in the early 1520s. Crowds gathered to stare at it, recognizing themselves in the painted figures. The king in his crown looked no different from the laborer in his tunic when the skeleton took their hands. Alongside these processional scenes, a smaller, more personal symbol began to appear on tombs, in prayer books, and on the walls of private chapels. Artists placed skulls, hourglasses, and wilting flowers wherever a viewer might pause. A portrait of a wealthy merchant might include a small skull in the corner, a quiet reminder that the gold he held would not follow him into the grave. This tradition, called memento mori, which means remember that you must die, asked the viewer to hold two thoughts at once: enjoy the present but never forget its end. The imagery was not meant to terrify, it was meant to ground. In a world that had seen so much passing, these symbols offered a kind of honesty. They did not pretend that life was permanent. They acknowledged the fragility at the heart of existence, and in doing so, they gave the viewer a way to live with that knowledge. The figures in these paintings changed as well. Before the plague, religious art had shown saints and martyrs as serene, untouchable beings. Their bodies were perfect, their faces calm. After the plague, artists began to paint a more realistic, more human version of suffering. Christ on the cross was no longer a distant, stylized figure. He became a man with visible wounds, strained muscles, and a face twisted in pain. The Virgin Mary wept openly, her expression raw and unguarded. This new realism, sometimes called Macabre realism, did not glorify suffering. It insisted that the holy had experienced the same kind of pain that ordinary people had just endured. The connection was direct and powerful. If Christ could suffer, then the suffering of a peasant or a merchant also held meaning. This shift in artistic taste was driven not only by a changed worldview, but by a change in who paid for the art. The old patrons, the church, and the great nobles still commissioned work, but a new class of buyers had emerged. The merchants and master craftsmen who had grown wealthy after the plague now had money to spend, and they wanted art that spoke to their own experience. They did not commission grand altarpieces showing the Last Judgment in distant heaven. They asked for portraits that showed their own faces, their fine clothes, and the tools of their trade. A successful wool merchant in Bruges might have himself painted holding a bolt of cloth, with a small crucifix hanging in the background. His wealth was on display, but so was his awareness that it would not last. These portraits often included a motto or a small inscription reminding the viewer that the man in the painting was mortal. The merchant wanted to be remembered not just for his gold, but for his wisdom in knowing that gold was temporary. The church, too, responded to this new sensibility. Chapels that had once been filled with golden altars and bright frescoes now included side panels showing the suffering of souls in purgatory, or the quiet dignity of a saint at the moment of passing. The emphasis shifted from the glory of heaven to the journey through death. This was not a rejection of faith, it was a deepening of it. The afterlife was no longer a distant promise. It was a reality that began the moment the last breath left the body. All of these changes in art were reflections of a deeper shift in how people understood their place in the world. The old certainties that life was stable, that the social order was fixed, that the church could protect you had crumbled. What remained was a stark, honest gaze at the shortness of life and the uncertainty of what came next. Artists gave that gaze a form. They painted death not as an ending to be feared, but as a presence to be acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement, there was a strange kind of freedom. If nothing was permanent, then what mattered most was how you lived the days you had. That question, how to live well in the face of uncertainty, would soon find expression not just in paint, but in the printed word itself. For centuries, the Pope had spoken with the voice of God, but after the plague, that voice began to crack. The Church had promised protection through prayer and ritual, yet the illness had swept through the faithful as easily as the unfaithful. No amount of holy water or blessing had stopped it. The Pope himself had fled Rome for Avignon in southern France in the year 1309, long before the plague arrived, but the timing could not have been worse. When the crisis hit, the highest authority in Christendom was living in a palace far from the traditional seat of power, surrounded by French influence. This move, called the Avignon Papacy, already had critics who accused the Church of abandoning its spiritual mission for political comfort. The plague only sharpened those accusations. If the Pope could not even be where St. Peter had walked, how could he protect the souls of the faithful from a disease no one understood? The situation grew worse when the Pope finally returned to Rome in 1377. His successor, Urban VI, proved so harsh and unpredictable that a group of cardinals declared his election invalid and chose a rival pope who set up court back in Avignon. Suddenly, Christendom had two popes, each claiming to be the true vicar of Christ, each excommunicating the other's followers. This was the Western Schism, and it lasted for nearly 40 years. Ordinary believers watched in confusion. If the church could not even agree on who its leader was, how could it claim to hold the keys to salvation? The schism shattered the image of a united, divine institution. It looked to many like a political squabble dressed in sacred robes. Into this vacuum stepped voices that had been whispering for years. In England, a scholar named John Wycliffe argued that the Bible, not the Pope, was the ultimate authority. He translated scripture into English so that common people could read it for themselves. He said that the church had become too wealthy and too worldly, and that true faith did not require a priestly hierarchy. His followers, called Lollards, spread these ideas through sermons and pamphlets, insisting that every person could have a direct relationship with God. Across the English Channel, in Bohemia, a preacher named Jan Hus took up a similar cry. He condemned the corruption he saw in the church and called for a return to the simplicity of the early Christian community. He, too, argued that the Bible should be available in the language of the people. Hus was eventually burned at the stake for his beliefs, but his ideas did not die with him. They spread through the networks of students and merchants who had traveled across Europe. These movements were not large enough to topple the church, but they planted the seeds of a deeper question that the plague had first opened. If the old authorities had failed, who could be trusted to guide the soul? The answer, for an increasing number of people, was no institution at all. The relationship between the individual and the divine was becoming a personal matter, and the church's monopoly on truth was beginning to show cracks that would widen into chasms in the centuries ahead. A generation after the last major outbreak, the fields remained emptier than they had ever been. The population of Europe did not bounce back quickly. It took nearly 2 centuries for the continent to reach the same number of people it had before the Black Death. In some regions, the recovery was even slower. Parts of Italy and southern Germany did not regain their pre-plague population until the early 16th century. The land itself remembered the loss. Villages that had been abandoned never came back. Their names faded from maps, and the fields that once fed families returned to forest or rough pasture. This permanent scar on the landscape was not a sign of failure. It reflected a fundamental shift in how people valued their own labor and their own lives. The most visible change was in the pockets of ordinary workers. For generations before the plague, wages had stayed low because there were always more hands than work. After the plague, the opposite was true. A farmhand who had earned a few pennies a day in 1300 could demand 4 or 5 times that amount a century later. And these higher wages did not go away when the population slowly began to recover. They stuck. Landowners had to accept that labor was no longer cheap, and they adjusted their entire approach to farming and business. Instead of relying on a large workforce of tied peasants, they turned toward more efficient methods. They consolidated small strips of land into larger, enclosed fields that could be worked by fewer people. They shifted from growing grain, which required many hands, to raising sheep, which needed only a handful of shepherds. Wool became the backbone of the English economy, and it was a direct response to the scarcity of human effort. This was the birth of commercial agriculture. Farmers no longer grew just enough to feed their own village. They produced for the market, selling wool, meat, and dairy to distant towns. The old subsistence model, where every family scratched out its own survival, gave way to a system based on trade and profit. Land that had once been held in common by a village was now divided and fenced. The open fields disappeared, and with them went the old collective rhythms of planting and harvest. It was a quieter transformation than the revolts and persecutions, but it reshaped the countryside just as deeply. While Europe slowly rebuilt, the vacuum left by the weakened Byzantine Empire drew in a new power from the east. The Ottoman Turks, who had already established a foothold in the Balkans, watched the empire to their northwest falter. The plague had struck Constantinople repeatedly, each wave draining its population and its treasury. The city that had once commanded the trade routes of the world became a shell, its walls still strong but its heart hollow. In the year 1453, the Ottomans under Sultan Mehmed II finally breached those walls and took the city. The fall of Constantinople was not just a military event. It closed a chapter that had lasted more than 1,000 years. The Ottomans then pushed deeper into the Balkans and the Middle East, filling the space left by the demographic collapse. They brought a stable administration and a new legal system to regions that had been fragmented by loss. Their expansion reshaped the map of the Eastern Mediterranean and set the stage for centuries of contest between Ottoman and European powers. In the opposite direction, the same demographic shock that emptied European villages also made possible something even more ambitious. With fewer people at home, there was less pressure on land. But there was also a restless energy among the survivors, young men and women who had grown up in a world where old rules no longer applied looked outward. They had heard stories of distant lands from the merchants who now sailed the Atlantic. The ships that had once carried wool and wine began to venture farther, down the coast of Africa and eventually across the ocean. The depopulation of the Americas after European contact, though caused by different illnesses, followed a similar logic of vulnerability. But the point is this: the same crisis that drained the old world of its people also pushed it to explore, to trade, and to colonize. The voyages of Columbus and Vasco da Gama were not disconnected from the plague. They were the distant echoes of a world that had been forced to adapt, a world where labor was valuable, where land could be had, and where the old horizons no longer bound the human spirit. The long arc of the plague reached far beyond the 14th century. It lifted wages, reshaped agriculture, enabled new empires, and pushed Europeans onto the global stage. The early modern world, with its commercial networks and colonial ambitions, was built on the foundation of that demographic earthquake. And as the next chapter of history unfolded, the beliefs that had been shattered by the plague would continue to fracture, giving rise to movements that would forever change how people understood authority, truth, and their own place in the cosmos. The devastation was not confined to Europe's shores. In the bustling markets of Cairo, the great capital of the Mamluk Sultanate, the silence was just as deafening. The plague had arrived in the Middle East by the same routes that carried it to Europe, along the Silk Road and across the Mediterranean. It struck the Islamic world with equal force, perhaps even greater in some regions. Egypt, the breadbasket of the Eastern Mediterranean, lost perhaps a third of its population. The Nile Valley, which had fed armies and cities for millennia, saw its villages empty. Fields that had been cultivated since the time of the pharaohs lay fallow because there were no hands to work them. The Mamluks, a warrior caste that had ruled Egypt and Syria for centuries, found their power base crumbling. Their army had been decimated. The peasants who paid the taxes that supported their cavalry and their fortifications had vanished. The state treasury shrank, and with it the ability to project force. In the cities of Damascus and Aleppo, the great covered markets known as souks fell quiet. Merchants who had once traded in silk, spices, and perfumes from as far away as India and China now sat idle. The caravans that had brought those goods across the desert stopped coming. The roads that connected the Middle East to Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent became dangerous and unprofitable. The old overland routes, which had made cities like Baghdad and Samarkand wealthy, were no longer viable. The same demographic collapse that emptied villages in England and France also emptied the trading posts of the Syrian desert and the oasis towns of North Africa. In the Maghreb, the coastal cities of Tunis and Fez saw their populations plummet. The trans-Saharan trade, which had carried gold, salt, and slaves across the vast desert, suffered a similar blow. The caravans required hundreds of camels and dozens of drivers and guards. When so many of those workers were lost, the caravans simply could not be organized. The gold that had once flowed from West Africa into the Mediterranean became scarce. The minting of coins slowed, and the economies of North Africa contracted. In the Arabian Peninsula, the holy cities of Mecca and Medina saw a dramatic drop in the number of pilgrims who could make the journey. The pilgrimage, a pillar of Islamic faith and a major economic driver, became a trickle. The merchants and innkeepers who had depended on the annual influx of visitors struggled to survive. The entire network of trade and belief that had connected the Islamic world for centuries was strained to its breaking point. As these overland routes declined, a fundamental shift began to take shape. The Europeans, who had been pushed to the margins of the old Silk Road, now saw an opportunity. Their maritime routes, which had grown in importance during the crisis, became the new arteries of commerce. Portuguese ships began to edge down the coast of Africa, searching for a direct path to the spice markets of India. Italian vessels dominated the Mediterranean, carrying goods from the eastern ports to the growing cities of Western Europe. The old centers of the Islamic world, the great crossroads of civilization, were being bypassed. The wealth that had once flowed through Cairo and Damascus now flowed through Lisbon and Antwerp. This was not a gradual change. It was a fundamental redrawing of the economic map. The plague had not only killed millions, it had shifted the center of gravity of the entire global system. The Islamic world, which had been the engine of trade and learning for centuries, began to recede from the forefront. The Europeans, driven by a combination of necessity and ambition, stepped into the vacuum, and as they did, the world entered a new era, one where the sea, not the desert, became the highway of history. The question that hung in the air was simple but profound. What would replace the old connections that had bound humanity together for so long? One answer emerged from the walls of the cities themselves. As trade routes shifted and populations moved, the survivors in the great urban centers faced a stark choice: either find a way to manage the recurring waves of illness or watch their cities empty for good. The old habit of fleeing at the first sign of trouble had proven useless. Too many people had already fled, and too many had died while staying. So the city governments, often led by the same merchants and guild masters who had grown wealthy from the new maritime trade, began to take matters into their own hands. They could not wait for the distant pope or emperor to act. They needed solutions that worked here and now. The first systematic boards of health appeared in the Italian city-states during the mid-14th century. Venice established a permanent health office, a panel of officials whose sole job was to monitor the arrival of ships, inspect cargo, and enforce quarantine rules. This was not a temporary measure during a crisis. It was a standing institution with paid staff, written records, and the authority to override even the orders of wealthy merchants. For the first time in European history, public health became a daily responsibility of the state, not a desperate response to an emergency. The board kept meticulous ledgers of every ship that entered the lagoon, every cargo that was fumigated, and every case of illness that appeared in the city. They hired guards to patrol the waterfront and report any suspicious activity. They paid informants in other ports to send word of outbreaks weeks before a ship arrived. This was intelligence gathering, pure and simple, applied to the invisible threat of disease. Alongside these boards, a new kind of building appeared on the outskirts of almost every major city: the plague hospital or lazzaretto. These were not hospitals in the modern sense. They were isolation centers, often built on small islands or in remote fields, where people who showed symptoms were sent to live out their remaining days apart from the healthy. The design was practical: The buildings had high ceilings and large windows to let in fresh air because people believed that bad air carried the illness. They had separate rooms for men and women, and sometimes separate wards for those who might recover. The staff were often convicts or volunteers who had already survived the illness since they were considered immune. The goal was not to cure because few cures existed. It was to contain. A person who entered a lazaretto rarely left alive, but the city outside was safer because they were there. Burial regulations changed just as dramatically. Before the plague, most people were buried in churchyards within the city walls, close to the living. After the crisis, that practice was seen as dangerous. Decaying remains, it was thought, might poison the air and bring another outbreak. So cities began to require that the dead be buried outside the walls, in large, carefully organized cemeteries far from wells and markets. In Paris, the great cemetery of the Holy Innocents was expanded and ringed with covered walkways where the bones of the long departed were stacked in tidy rows. In Venice, a whole island, San Michele, was set aside as a burial ground. The dead were no longer part of the daily life of the city. They were moved to the margins both physically and symbolically. This separation was a profound shift in how communities related to death. It turned passing from a communal event, witnessed in the home and mourned in the church, into a private, even hidden affair. All of these measures, the health boards, the lazarettos, the remote cemeteries, required an enormous amount of paperwork. Officials recorded the names of the sick, the dates of quarantine, the cargo manifests of every ship, the number of deaths in each parish. They issued health passes, documents that travelers had to carry to prove they had come from a clean area. They kept registers of burials, noting the cause of passing and the location of the grave. This bureaucracy was clumsy and often corrupt, but it was a beginning. It gave governments a new tool, information. For the first time, a city could look at a ledger and see where the outbreaks were coming from, which months were the most dangerous, which neighborhoods had the highest risk. The seeds of modern statistics, of population tracking, of epidemiology, were planted in these simple ledgers kept by bored clerks on Venetian islands and in Parisian offices. And because all this record-keeping was tied to health, it began to associate the idea of cleanliness with morality. A merchant who kept his shop clean, who aired his goods, who washed his hands, was seen as not just healthier but more virtuous. A city that enforced sanitation rules was seen as a well-governed city. Dirt and disorder became linked not only with illness but with sin and laziness. This connection would deepen over the coming centuries, influencing everything from the design of homes to the layout of streets to the way people thought about their own bodies. The plague had taught them that the invisible world could kill, and now they were learning that order, cleanliness, and vigilance might be the only defenses they had. The foundations of the modern state, with its health departments, its records, and its insistence on public order, were being laid on the very soil where so many had been laid to rest. When death became a daily neighbor, the way people lived changed just as deeply. The randomness of the passing forced survivors to ask an uncomfortable question. If tomorrow is not guaranteed, what ought I do with today? Two opposing answers emerged from that question, and both shaped the culture of the post-plague world for generations. The first answer was a celebration of the present moment, a determination to seize pleasure before it slipped away. In the hills outside Florence, a writer named Giovanni Boccaccio captured this spirit in his collection of stories called the Decameron. The frame of the book is simple. 10 young people flee the city to escape the illness and spend 10 days telling each other tales. Their stories are full of wit, romance, trickery, and laughter. They are not concerned with the afterlife. They are about the joy and folly of being alive right now. Boccaccio wrote this work in the shadow of immense loss, and its message was clear. When the world seems dark, there is still room for humor, love, and human connection. Across the English Channel, Geoffrey Chaucer began writing the Canterbury Tales a few decades later. His pilgrims traveling to a shrine also passed the time by telling stories. Their tales range from the pious to the bawdy, from the serious to the absurd. Like the Decameron, the Canterbury Tales is a celebration of variety, of the many ways people find meaning and joy in a world that offers no guarantees. Chaucer's characters are not saints. They are flawed, greedy, lustful, and kind. They are fully, messily human, and that is precisely the point. This embrace of earthly life, the idea that pleasure and beauty are not sins but gifts to be enjoyed while they last, became known in later centuries as Carpe Diem, seize the day. It was not a philosophy written in formal treatises. It lived in the stories people told each other, in the songs they sang, and in the fashions they wore. Young people began to dress more brightly, to spend their earnings on feasts and fine cloth, because saving for a future that might not come seemed foolish. But this sunny outlook was only one side of the coin. The other side was a deep and somber turn away from the world. If life was brief and uncertain, some argued, then why cling to it at all? Why not reject the fleeting pleasures of the flesh and focus entirely on what was eternal? This attitude, called contemptus mundi, or contempt for the world, spread through religious communities and among the laity. Preachers reminded their congregations that the body was dust, that wealth was vanity, and that earthly joys were traps that led the soul away from salvation. The world was a place of sorrow and trial, and the only wise response was to withdraw from its temptations. This was not a new idea in Christianity, but the plague gave it a new urgency. If death could come at any moment, then a person who spent their life chasing pleasure risked dying unprepared. So some chose the opposite path. They gave away their possessions, wore simple clothes, fasted, and devoted themselves to prayer. Monasteries saw a brief surge in new members, though the trend did not last long. The most extreme examples of this world rejection were the hermits and anchorites who chose to live in isolation, but the attitude also shaped everyday life. Many people began to commission art that focused on the brevity of life, such as paintings of skulls and hourglasses, not as decorations but as daily reminders to stay focused on what mattered. These two impulses, to seize the day and to renounce the world, were not as separate as they seem. They came from the same root, the recognition that life was fragile and that time was short. One response said, "Make the most of it while you can." The other said, "Do not be tricked by it." Both were attempts to impose meaning on a reality that seemed random and cruel. And both left their mark on the intimate structures of daily life, especially on the family. When a parent or spouse could be gone within a week, the way people formed and maintained families changed. Marriages happened earlier because there was no time to waste. Widows and widowers remarried quickly, often within months of a loss. Children who lost both parents were taken in by extended family or by the community, and the old practice of leaving large inheritances to a single eldest son began to give way to more flexible arrangements. Some parents, uncertain which of their children would survive, spread their property more evenly among all of them. Others, fearful of leaving a fortune to be squandered, donated generously to the church, hoping that charity would secure their soul in the next world. The fragility of life made every decision about property and lineage a gamble. The stories people told, the way they dressed, the way they married and died, all of it was shaped by that single, unanswerable fact: no one knew when their turn would come. And in that uncertainty, both the laughter and the prayer, the bright cloth and the bare cell, were attempts to find a path through the dark. That same uncertainty entered every home, rearranging the most intimate relationships. The plague did not only strike individuals, it struck entire households, often leaving only one or two survivors where there had once been a full family. A father, a mother, several children, grandparents, all living under one roof. After the illness passed, that roof might shelter only a widow and a single child, or an orphan boy alone in a house that suddenly felt far too large. The old patterns of domestic life, built on the assumption that parents would raise their children and that property would pass from one generation to the next in an orderly line, were thrown into chaos. The most immediate consequence was a surge in remarriages. A widow who had lost her husband might find herself with children to feed and a farm or workshop to manage. She could not run it alone, so she looked for a new partner, often within months of her loss. A widower with young children needed someone to care for them while he worked in the fields or at the forge. He, too, remarried quickly. These second marriages often created blended families, where children from two different households suddenly became step-siblings, living under the same roof with a new step-parent they barely knew. The bonds of affection in these new families were often fragile. Disputes over property became common. A stepfather might favor his own children over the ones from his wife's first marriage. A widow who remarried might lose control of the land her first husband had left her because the new husband claimed it as his own. Inheritance, once a straightforward matter of passing goods from parent to eldest child, now became a tangle of conflicting claims. Notaries in Italian cities and lawyers in English market towns found their services in high demand. Wills became more detailed, more frequent, and more fiercely contested. Some parents, uncertain which of their children would survive to adulthood, wrote wills that spread their property across many relatives, hoping that at least one would carry on the family name. Others, mistrustful of the intentions of a new spouse, set aside portions of their estate specifically for the children of their first marriage. The law struggled to keep up. Courts in many regions began to recognize the rights of widows more clearly, allowing them to hold property independently rather than automatically transferring it to a new husband. This was a quiet but significant gain. A woman whose husband had passed could now inherit the family home, the tools of a trade or a plot of land, and she could manage it in her own name. She could sell it, lease it, or pass it to her children as she saw fit. In many cases, she became the head of the household, making decisions that had once been reserved for men. This new authority did not last forever. As the population slowly recovered and the labor market tightened again, some of these gains were rolled back. But for a generation or two, women in many parts of Europe held a degree of economic independence that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. The records of town councils and church courts from the late 14th century are filled with women who appear as litigants, property owners, and business managers. They were not just surviving, they were actively shaping the households that would rebuild the world. At the same time, the number of children left without any parent at all reached unprecedented levels. Orphanages, which had existed in a few large cities before the plague, now became essential institutions. In Florence, the Hospital of the Innocents, a grand building designed by the architect Filippo Brunelleschi, opened its doors in the early 15th century specifically to care for abandoned and orphaned children. It was one of the first institutions of its kind in Europe, built with the explicit purpose of raising children who had no family. Similar homes appeared in Venice, Paris, and London. They were funded by a combination of city taxes, private donations, and bequests from wealthy citizens who wanted to ensure their own salvation by giving to the poor. These orphanages did not just feed and shelter children, they taught them trades. Boys learned carpentry, shoemaking, or weaving. Girls learned sewing, embroidery, and household management. The goal was to turn them into productive adults who could support themselves and contribute to the community. This was a new idea, that society had a responsibility for children who were not its own. It was a direct response to the thousands of young lives that had been left adrift by the plague. Charitable institutions of all kinds expanded during this period. Hospitals, which had originally been places of hospitality for travelers, began to focus more on caring for the sick and the poor. Almshouses were built to shelter the elderly who had outlived their families. Confraternities, lay religious organizations, took on the task of visiting the sick, burying the poor, and supporting widows. The impulse to give, to organize, and to care for the vulnerable grew stronger as the memory of the crisis remained fresh. These institutions were not perfect. They were often crowded, underfunded, and run by officials who were more interested in control than compassion. But they represented a fundamental shift in how communities thought about the idea of family. When blood relatives could not be relied upon, the community itself had to step in. The household was no longer a private island. It was connected to a network of charitable organizations, legal protections, and public institutions that had been built in response to the catastrophe. The intimate fabric of daily life, the way people married, raised children, managed property, and cared for the old, had been rewoven by the same force that had torn it apart. And that rewoven fabric, with all its new patterns of remarriage, female authority, and public charity, became part of the invisible architecture of the early modern world. The plague did not simply kill, it reshaped the very idea of home. But these three currents, trade, labor, and belief, never ran in isolation. They twisted together like strands of a rope, each pulling on the others in ways that remade the whole fabric of society. The labor shortage that gave workers higher wages also changed what they bought and how they thought about money itself. A peasant who had once earned just enough to live on now had a few extra coins in his pocket at the end of the week. He did not hoard them, he spent them on things his grandparents could never have afforded. A better cut of cloth for a new tunic, a pair of leather shoes, a pewter spoon instead of a wooden one. This surge in demand from ordinary people created a new market for goods that had once been luxuries. Merchants who had lost their long-distance routes now looked closer to home. They began producing cheaper versions of the fine textiles and metalwork that had previously been reserved for the nobility. The same weavers who had once woven silk for the rich now turned out woolen broadcloth for the growing middle class. The same smiths who had made armor for knights now forged cooking pots and tools for households. The economy did not just shrink and then recover, it shifted. Production became more local, more responsive to the needs of everyday people, and that shift reinforced the power of the towns that housed these workshops. At the same time, the collapse of long-distance trade isolated communities in a way that had not been seen for centuries. When the caravans stopped and the ships grew scarce, villages and small cities were thrown back on their own resources. They could no longer rely on imported spices to flavor their food or exotic dyes to color their cloth. They had to make do with what they could grow or trade with their immediate neighbors. This isolation did not weaken belief, it intensified it. When the outside world became distant and dangerous, the local church or mosque became the center of identity. The saints and rituals that had always been part of daily life took on a new importance. They were the familiar in a world turned strange, the congregation that gathered each Sunday in the same stone church, reciting the same prayers that their parents and grandparents had recited, found comfort in that repetition. The local priest who had buried half the village was now not just a spiritual guide but a living link to the past. This turn inward made communities more resistant to outside influences. They clung to their own traditions with a fierce devotion, and that devotion sometimes hardened into suspicion of anyone who did not share it. The persecution of outsiders that flared during the plague years was not a separate event. It was the dark side of this same localism. When the world beyond the village gates seemed threatening, the stranger within the gates became an enemy. But isolation also had a counterintuitive effect on economic behavior. The old religious prohibitions that had governed money lending began to bend. For centuries, the church had condemned usury, the practice of charging interest on loans, as a sin. Money, it was taught, was sterile. It should not breed like livestock, but the plague had wiped out so much capital that those who had coin to lend were in a position of unprecedented power. A merchant who had lost a shipment of goods needed a loan to buy new stock. A lord whose tenants had died needed cash to hire laborers. Without credit, the entire economy would have stalled. Slowly, the teaching began to shift. Theologians argued that if a lender took a risk, he deserved a return. If a borrower used a loan to make a profit, it was only fair that the lender share in that profit. The distinction between a sinful usurer and an honest investor grew blurry. By the end of the 14th century, many of the Italian city-states had legalized interest rates of 10 or 15%. The great banking families of Florence and Venice, the Medici and the Bardi, built their fortunes on this new acceptance. They lent money to kings and popes, financed trade ventures, and underwrote the construction of cathedrals. Their rise would have been impossible without the moral flexibility that the plague crisis had forced upon the church. So the loops turned. Higher wages created demand, which reshaped production. Isolation deepened local faith, which in turn justified new economic practices. The old certainties about money, about community, about salvation itself had all been cracked open. And out of those cracks grew a new equilibrium, one where the peasant in his new tunic, the merchant with his interest-bearing loan, and the priest in his local parish were all part of the same transformed world. It was not a world anyone had planned. It was a world that had been stitched together by the survivors, one decision at a time, in the long shadow of the catastrophe they had endured. The world that emerged from the plague years was not a repaired version of the old one. It was a new creation built on foundations that no one had planned. The feudal order, with its fixed classes and inherited obligations, crumbled because the people who had held it together were gone. In their place came a society where labor had value, where a peasant could bargain, and where a merchant could rise. That was the birth of capitalism, not as an idea in a book, but as a daily reality in fields and workshops where workers demanded better terms and entrepreneurs found ways to meet them. The church, which had once stood as the unshakable source of truth, lost its monopoly on meaning. People began to read scripture for themselves, to seek God in private prayer, and to question the authority of priests who had failed to protect them. That crack in the wall of religious authority widened over the next century and eventually split open in the Reformation. The individual, not the institution, became the center of spiritual life. Trade routes that had connected continents for centuries were shattered, but from their ruins came a new maritime network that tied Europe to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The ships that carried wool and wine now carried ambition across oceans. The map of the world was redrawn by the survivors. It is tempting to think that the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Age of Exploration would have happened anyway, that human progress follows an inevitable path. But the evidence suggests otherwise. The Renaissance flowered in the very cities where the plague had created a new class of wealthy patrons who wanted art that reflected their own lives. The Reformation grew from the soil of a faith that had been forced to ask hard questions about authority and salvation. The voyages of discovery were launched by nations that had learned to look outward because their own lands had emptied. Without the demographic shock, without the millions who did not return, each of those movements might have remained a whisper, a possibility that never took hold. The plague was not a single event that passed and left the world unchanged. It was a door that opened onto a different future. The survivors walked through that door, carrying with them the tools they had forged in crisis, a new respect for human effort, a willingness to challenge authority, a hunger for connection across distant seas, and a quiet, persistent belief that life, however brief, could be meaningful. And today, when we look at our own systems of trade, our struggles for fair labor, our search for meaning in uncertain times, we are still walking through that door. The past is not separate from us. It lives in the contracts we sign, the rights we demand, the questions we ask of our leaders, and the stories we tell about who we are. The plague did not end. It reshaped the world, and that world is still ours. The same currents that reshaped trade, labor, and belief in the 14th century continue to flow beneath the surface of our own time. That invisible force, the plague, was not a mere interruption in history. It was a turning point that redirected the course of entire civilizations. The survivors did not simply rebuild what had been lost. They built something new, something that recognized the value of human effort, questioned inherited authority, and reached across oceans for connection. The wages that rose then, the rights that were demanded, the institutions of public health that were born, and the personal faith that emerged from the ruins are all strands woven into the fabric of the modern world. Today, when a new pandemic emerges, we see echoes of that older crisis. We see the same tension between individual freedom and collective safety. We see the same scramble to protect trade routes and supply chains. We see the same search for meaning in the face of uncertainty. The questions asked by those who lived through the plague are still our questions. Who do we trust? How do we care for the vulnerable? And what do we owe to each other when the old rules no longer apply? The answers they found were imperfect, sometimes cruel, always shaped by the limits of their knowledge. But they remind us that crises do not simply destroy. They clarify, they strip away what is unnecessary and force us to decide what truly matters. If you have made it this far, you understand that history is not a dusty collection of dates and names. It is a living conversation between the past and the present. That conversation continues every time we choose how to respond to the challenges of our own era. If this journey through the hidden forces of history has sparked your curiosity, please take a moment to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think the next great crisis will teach us? Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you do not miss the next deep dive into the mysteries that shaped our world. The lessons of the past are waiting for those who are willing to listen.